All right, folks, we are just like 2 weeks away from college football. It's the longest off season in sports, but hey, we've almost made it through to college football. We bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Hey, Joe, how are you?
How are you, Mark? It's great. We're about 13 days away from the start of the college football season. What more can you ask for? I'm chomping at the bit here.
I am too, and I think you're really dialed in on this Wednesday night game, this Abilene Christian Georgia State game. I think this is the one you're probably really zeroed in on. No, we'll move on to Thursday night. I don't want you to blow us away with your Abilene Christian knowledge for like 30 minutes here. So we'll move on to Texas A&M and South Carolina. I think that's really the one that a few people out there are kind of locked in on. So Texas A&M, new quarterback going to be on the field. South Carolina, they lose Clowney and Shaw, whole bunch of guys on defense. So your thoughts about the big SEC opener?
Well, I think on paper it looks like South Carolina will dominate. They've dominated on Thursday night before. They won 7 straight ball games on Thursday night. So favors South Carolina. But when you look at last season, they opened up against North Carolina and Larry Fedora's offense. They dominated early, but then you saw that offense in the second and third quarters be able to move the football against the Gamecock defense with Jadeveon Clowney. Now, Texas A&M, no Johnny Manziel, no Ben Molina, and no Mike Evans, but they do have an up-tempo offense that could possibly put some pressure on that South Carolina defense. I think it'll be a little bit closer than people think. Still leaning towards South Carolina. I think they have more weapons. Mike Davis, Dylan Thompson, experienced quarterback, not as experienced as Connor Shaw, but I'm leaning towards a very close South Carolina victory on Thursday night. But I think it should be an interesting ball game.
Yeah, technically they lose their starting quarterback, but Dylan Thompson's been in the fire against Clemson. He won a football game with 300 yards passing a couple years ago, won the bowl game against Michigan in the last 10 seconds. So he's been in the midst of a big-time competition on the big stage. Now, on the other hand, Texas A&M, wow, they go with either a freshman quarterback in Kyle Allen or the sophomore who hasn't played a ton in Kenny Hill in a hostile environment, one of the biggest you're going to find in college football at South Carolina. So I definitely think the Gamecocks have a huge advantage here. I think they're catching A&M at the right time, breaking in a new quarterback.
The one thing to keep in mind.
Let's see what we got here.
Let me just ask you one thing to keep in mind. How is South Carolina going to be looking ahead to week number 2 against Georgia? That's the only other factor that you have to keep in mind. A very young, inexperienced defense by Steve Spurrier. So just that's a note in that ball game as well. How does the team react early? And if they jump up early, can they keep the momentum for 4 quarters?
I think if they the right character and the right leaders in the locker room, they don't look ahead, but we know that football teams do. Teams that are very honest with us, coaches, players, they admit at times that they look ahead. Right. Shouldn't look past a Kevin Sumlin team, Texas A&M. It's got a ton of talent, but we'll see if the defense comes along and is any better than it was when it was just simply atrocious last year. Maybe a little bit under the radar, but a nice little matchup in Atlanta with Boise State taking on Ole Miss. The Rebels looking for big things coming off that big recruiting class a season and a half ago.
I think this is an interesting matchup, but to me, it favors Ole Miss in every way, shape, or form. A couple of years ago, you saw what the recruiting did in some of the better teams within the conferences, such as Michigan State facing Boise State. They won that game 17-13, but if you watched that game a couple of years ago, you started to see the change in terms of the recruiting that Boise State got. They finished the season 11-2 2 years ago, but then a very uncharacteristic 8-5 season. They opened up last year against Washington on the road and got blown out. They're going to be facing a very physical offense and defensive line in Ole Miss. Veteran quarterback in Bo Wallace. He's got some speed on the outside. Treadwell's a burner, and that defense. I think this is a very, very difficult matchup for Boise State. I think it's a blowout by Ole Miss. I know it's early, first game of the season, but I really think Ole Miss outmans them on both sides of the ball, and I'm not sold on Grant Hendrick at quarterback for Boise State.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing the same signs right there. I think traditionally Boise State really locks in on these kind of games. They played Virginia Tech about 10 years ago when Tech was like a top 5 and they took them out. They went to Georgia. They went to Atlanta right in the heart of SEC country. Made Georgia look silly about 5 years ago, but this isn't the same Boise State program that Chris Peterson built. New head coach, Harsin coming in as well. And again, I think Ole Miss is prime to make a move in the SEC Western Division. Kim Dichie is going to be a tear on that defensive front. Laramie Tunzel, the best offensive tackle coming out of high school 2 years ago, was all SEC as a freshman on the second team. So, yeah, Laquan Treadwell, amazing athlete, caught 72 balls as a freshman. They're ready to explode. I think Ole Miss is a much better, more athletic team, just faster and going to make big plays in this game. And flying under the radar, if you have any comments about Rutgers and Washington State, Rutgers makes its debut as a Big Ten team going out west to Washington State with Mike Leach trying to get back to a bowl game.
I think this is another interesting matchup. When you mentioned Rutgers, they struggled last year in a couple of ball games against teams that challenged them vertically. The first game of the season, Derek Carr and Fresno State, an amazing game, 4 overtimes. Watching that game on the East Coast, that game ended about 4 o'clock in the morning. But they struggled defensively for a very uncharacteristic Scarlet Knight team, giving up a lot of points in terms of scoring points. They gave up over 50 to Fresno State and then 49 to Houston at home. So a very uncharacteristic defense by Kyle Flood. They do get a plus. Ralph Friedgen, the former Maryland head coach, is the offensive coordinator, should help Gary Nova, the senior quarterback, but he's been inconsistent in the passing game. I was at that spring game. The one thing I noticed is that in terms of passing options, Friedgen giving the quarterbacks a lot of checkdowns. They have more passing options to stretch defenses vertically, but I still think it's a very tough battle for Rutgers to go to the West Coast against a very sophisticated passing offense from Mike Leach, the head coach, and quarterback Connor Holiday. Very, very, very underrated Pac-12 quarterback. And when you look at this Washington State Cougar team, they could be a sleeper in the Pac-12, not top 2, top 3 like UCLA or Oregon, but they could be right there in the mix to challenge some teams within the conference. So I think it's a very difficult matchup for Rutgers.
Now, if you overdose on football on that opening weekend, you can do it even a little bit more than usual, because if you catch, I think it's that late Arizona-Vegas game on Friday night, then you got to get up really early to catch Penn State and Central Florida playing in Ireland. Now, right. I just have to do it. I got to get up. I got to get ready for that Penn State-Central Florida game. That game went right down to the wire at Happy Valley last year with Blake Bortles pulling it out. And now they go with a redshirt freshman quarterback in Pete DeNovo, who's selected as the starter there for Central Florida. But Christian Hackenberg coming back could be a fun game to watch.
A very fun game. When you look at this ball game last year, a very entertaining ball game. UCF jumped out early. They had a hold on. Storm Johnson, Blake Bortles really stepped up. Penn State going on the road to Dublin, Ireland with a new head coach in James Franklin. How are they going to fare with a different offensive scheme that Bill O'Brien made? Bill O'Brien really catered to Christian Hackenberg's strengths. Now you have a new head coach in James Franklin. Great head coach, but he ran the spread at Vanderbilt. It's going to take a little bit of time, in my opinion, to get used to the personnel that he has in Happy Valley with that offense. Very young, very raw. On the other side of the ball, UCF is going to miss Blake Bortles, but George O'Leary, a very underrated defensive head coach. He was a defensive coordinator at G-Tech. That's his strength, and I think that's what gives the Central Knights the edge in this matchup. I like Central Knights UCF in this matchup because not really a lot expected from this team with the departure of Storm Johnson and with the departure of Blake Bortles to Jacksonville. I think they play loose. I think they come out of the gates, and they have something to prove after last year's Fiesta Bowl win.
Yeah, and I think something that got a little bit ignored last season, obviously it was the focus was on Bortles, Storm Johnson. They scored a ton of points. They gave up some points. They get to the Fiesta Bowl. They're a substantial underdog against Baylor, and sure, they put up a ton of points, and yeah, they gave up like 32, but against Baylor, they basically tackled in space. They limited the big play. They got a good lead, and the defense did what it had to do. Now they've got like 9 or 10 starters back from that defense, so the defense may carry them a little bit more than people expect this year. UCLA and Virginia, the Cavaliers, not a whole lot going for them. We did a schedule analysis on the Cavaliers just a few days ago. It's a brutal schedule that they have to play, and it starts with UCLA, and all eyes on UCLA with Brett Hundley and company at number 7 preseason.
Well, this is a very difficult matchup for Virginia at home. Last year they played Oregon, and they played it pretty close. I think Mike London made a little bit of a mistake last year. They fell behind early, and they got away from running the football with Kevin Parks. Not a lot of experience at the quarterback position. Last year, Watford didn't really come around, so they struggled in terms of stretching teams vertically. They're going to have to control the clock against a very potent UCLA offense and Brett Hundley. You mentioned it. They have to control the line of scrimmage with Kevin Parks. The one plus for this Virginia team is that they have a very experienced secondary. There are a lot of seniors and juniors in that group. They got burned a few years ago as sophomores, but a lot of game experience to possibly keep defense in the ballgame. But if they fall behind early and aren't able to run the football, I think it could be a long day. That's where it should be a very tough game for Virginia. They can keep it close, but they have to run the football, and they have a brutal schedule. They also play BYU, another tough matchup, and I believe they play Louisville.
Yeah, they got they're in the division with Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech and North Carolina. It's kind of the lesser of the two divisions, but they draw the tougher teams in the other division, Florida State and Louisville. And then they got UCLA and BYU, as you mentioned. So not a difficult assignment for Mike London, and he's on the hot seat. So he needs to pull off a few upsets. Probably 4 or 5 wins after that 2-10 is needed to keep his job. Right. All right, West Virginia, Alabama. Joe, you alluded to this game a couple weeks ago when we talked top 25, and I think you kind of like this one. You're a little intrigued by the Alabama situation at quarterback, still a little bit unsettled, although we all think Jay Coker's going to win it. Blake Sims is pushing him right now, and West Virginia comes in with Clint Trickett at quarterback.
Well, I think that on paper it all favors Alabama. We've seen it before. They've dominated these opening week games, Clemson, Virginia Tech twice, and then Michigan. Teams seem to be intimidated by the Alabama name coming even before the ball's even kicked off. So I think that when West Virginia plays this ball game, they're going to have to start fast. I think Dana Holgorsen is on the hot seat. He's going to have to put out all the stops in this matchup. Couple of factors. Number one, you mentioned Jay Coker and then Lane Kiffin, a new offensive coordinator and a new quarterback at the same time for Nick Saban. First time in a long time that Nick Saban's not only going in with a new quarterback, but a new raw offensive coordinator. I know Kiffin came in last year prior to the Sugar Bowl, but he's still raw in terms of his first season in Tuscaloosa. How is that going to play out? There's going to be growing pains, in my opinion. When Nussmeier was there and he took over for Jim McElwain as offensive coordinator, A.J. McCarron was a veteran quarterback, already won a national championship. A little bit different. I know Coker has big playability. He's on the Maxwell Award list already without having to play a game for Alabama, almost beat out Jameis Winston. But I like the up-tempo attack by West Virginia. You look at what Oklahoma did in that Sugar Bowl victory with Trevor Knight, stretching the defense. I think they have a chance to keep it close. Russell Shell and running back Smith can run the football between the tackles. If they're able to get some early success, could be a lot closer than people think. I'm not calling for the outright upset. I just think that West Virginia early could be in striking distance. If it gets close down the stretch, look out Alabama.
Yeah, I just think Nick Saban's probably going to play it close to the vest. He's got the three-headed monster headed up by T.J. Yeldon at running back, and he's going to need to test these quarterbacks, no question about it. But compare his situation to Kevin Sumlin, where he's going to have to break in a new quarterback, possibly a true freshman at South Carolina, versus taking on West Virginia, a 2-7 team in the Big 12 last year, then Florida International, then it's like, or Florida Atlantic and Southern Miss before they have to gear up for Florida. So Saban's got a cushion there where he can rely on the running game and the defense to break in the quarterback before he has to get ready for that Florida defense in Game 4. So a bit of a different situation where Saban's got a cushion there. We've got a Cal-Northwestern matchup, Joe, where Northwestern kind of intrigues me in the sense that, you know, this is always the little team that could, and Pat Fitzgerald got them to a point where they go 10-3. They beat Mississippi State in the Gator Bowl. They look really good at the early portions of last season, play Ohio State really close, and ever since then it's been injuries, issues, Venrick Mark announcing that he's leaving the school, and Northwestern has just kind of crumbled under the weight in the last year.
Well, when you look at this Northwestern team, you mentioned it last year. I mean, that Ohio State game really took the wind out of their sails. A very emotional game, national spotlight, having the lead early in the third quarter and then allowing it to slip to Urban Meyer and basically Carlos Hyde taking over in the fourth quarter. Once they lost that ball game, a different type of Northwestern team. And then you mentioned it, a couple of tough losses on the road in Lincoln. They lose to a Hail Mary and Ron Kellogg throwing the Hail Mary to win that ball game. They lose to Iowa. A very, very tough stretch for the Northwestern Wildcats. I had Phil Steele on my show this week. He likes Northwestern to be a sleeper in the Big Ten this year. He likes that. He thinks they have a lot of talent. He likes what they were able to do last year, and he said that Trevor Simeon's a very solid quarterback. I agree with that, but when you're talking about this matchup against Cal, very underrated Cal team. I know they went 1-11 last year with Sonny Dykes, but if you watch that offense, two things that stood out for me. Jared Goff, the true freshman, came in, became one of the most successful quarterbacks in the Pac-12. He's got another year under Sonny Dykes' system, and Sonny Dykes builds programs. You look at what he did with Louisiana Tech 2 years ago, averaging 51 points per game. When Skip Holtz took over last year, that same team only averaging about 20, 22 points per game. So Sonny Dykes is an evaluator of talent. This was about a 12 to 13 point game last year at home in Cal Berkeley. I like Cal in this ball game to keep it close. I think they could stretch the Northwestern defense. I'm not sold on what Northwestern did in terms of secondary last year. Simeon, the solid quarterback, but I think Cal has a shot to pull off the upset one.
And some people might dismiss the Sonny Dykes coaching performance at Louisiana Tech, but that Tech team won 9 or 10 ball games, including taking Johnny Manziel to the wire in a game with Texas A&M, and that Texas A&M team, we know what they did in blowing out Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. So very impressive there. Arkansas and Auburn, the Hogs, winless in the SEC last season. Auburn, the winless 2 years ago, and then they turn off one of the incredible stories in college football history, going from 0-8, 3-9 overall, all the way to the BCS championship game. No Nick Marshall, at least not starting the football game. Jeremy Johnson, we saw him in spring ball. He's a big kid. He's like 6'5", a really big kid that can wing the football. I don't know if he knows where it's going at this point, but the strong arm and the type of athlete that you would expect a quarterback for Auburn. Jonathan Mincy, defensive back for Auburn, also not going to start in this first game because of marijuana suspensions there. So we got Arkansas and Auburn having to play down on the plains. Brett Bielema, the Heat's probably the honeymoon has ended, and he needs to start winning some football games.
I think he got a rude awakening about what the SEC conference is all about last year. He just thought he could line up at the line of scrimmage with a better offensive line like he did in Wisconsin and run 70 times a game. You can't do that in the SEC when you have defensive linemen that clog the holes and can run in their physical. So a rude awakening for Brett Bielema. I think this game comes down to tempo, though. When you look at the Arkansas defense, not very good in run support last year, and I think it's going to carry through into this ball game on the Plains in Auburn, with or without Nick Marshall. You talk about Artis Payne, the running back. Sammy Coates could possibly be one of the biggest underrated wide receivers in the SEC. I know he makes a lot of big plays off of play action, but it's the Gus Malzahn tempo of offense that's really going to put a lot of pressure on this Arkansas defense. I think it's a blowout for Auburn, with or without Nick Marshall. Too much offensive talent for the Tigers in this matchup.
Yeah, Arkansas's got to find a quarterback. Brandon Allen was, if you look at the stats, they're not good. But if you look at his stats against the SEC, they're even worse. He was like a 45% passer, threw more picks than touchdowns. I've got an Arkansas guy who says, hey, he dove for the pylon against Southern Miss, hurt the shoulder. He was never the same, couldn't make the throw. So we're going to see if that claim holds up and that he bounces back and shows that he's a legitimate SEC quarterback. For me in Arkansas, it's all about that they've got the two excellent running backs, Jonathan Williams and Alex Collins. They have an offensive line, as you point out, that Bielema's been able to take what they had plus recruited, and the offensive line is SEC caliber. So is the defensive line. They just have no playmakers on the outside. They don't have a quarterback. They don't have a back seven on defense. They just got ripped apart on the back seven on defense, and so it's tough to rebuild in the SEC, especially in that division. So it could be another rough one for Arkansas. I just don't see them getting anything more than 4 or 5 wins out of that schedule.
I
Joe,
agree with that.
Last season at this time, everybody was talking about Clemson, Georgia. Not a whole lot of people talking about this game necessarily as much as they were when both teams were close to the top 5 at this point last year, but still a really nice football game. Clemson going with Cole Stout, who's been waiting patiently behind Taj Boyd, finally gets his crack at quarterback as a senior. Georgia, Aaron Murray had a great career, couldn't get it done in regards to an SEC championship. That's what they really want. South Carolina does too. And they're going to meet in week 2, as you mentioned. But coming off this opener, this is just a fun game that you like to see the best in the ACC and the SEC lineup, and this is exactly what this game is.
I think this is the best game of Saturday. I know you like LSU, Wisconsin. That's the game that you have to watch. This is the game that I have to watch to be a college football fan. If I miss this game, I will give up my right as the biggest college football fan in the country, because this has so many questions that I want to see answered. How will Cole Stout fill in for Taj Boyd? He's loosey-goosey. If you're watching the internet reports, he's challenging teammates, acting as a mannequin in the clubhouse, scaring his teammates. He's relaxed. That's a good sign if you're a Clemson Tiger fan. You want your quarterback opening week to be very loose and not tight, going up against a very good and solid Georgia defense led by Jeremy Pruitt. When you look at Georgia right now, a lot of questions that you want to see answered. Number one, how will the defense respond with defensive coordinator Jeremy Pruitt? Could not create a lot of turnovers last year against opposing offenses with Todd Grantham. They lost 5 straight games in terms of the turnover battle. So he reduced in terms of the play calling, made it more of a reactionary defense, and the players are buying in. So that's a question mark I want to see answered in Athens on Saturday is how will the Georgia defense respond? Todd Gurley, Keith Marshall, how healthy are they? I want to see that. Reports are they are very, very healthy, look great in camp. We'll have to see. And then fifth-year senior quarterback Hudson Mason, how is he going to respond filling in for Aaron Murray, the SEC leading quarterback in terms of touchdown passes and Georgia records that he just broke last year? How is he going to step up and show leadership? I think this game right now favors Georgia because they are at home. A lot of offensive weapons to really support Hudson Mason. But how will that Clemson defense and Vic Beasley step up, coming off that dominating performance over Ohio State in the Orange Bowl? That's another question that you want to see answered in this ball game. Offensive talent on both sides of the ball should be a very, very interesting matchup. I just think that this game really favors Georgia because of the offensive talent supporting Hudson Mason.
Was that a dominant performance in the Orange Bowl? They did give up 35, Joe.
Yeah, but, you know, when you look at that ball game, Mark, it was the speed on the edge by Beasley, the ability to get to Braxton Miller, the ability to really come back and come from behind and make plays, create turnovers, something that ACC defenses really haven't been able to do in these big matchups. Yeah, it was a high-scoring affair, but they were able to create turnovers and get big plays when the offense really needed them to come up big. And that's something that really goes unnoticed in terms of the points scored.
Definitely, you're right. Ohio State made plays, but who's not going to give up points to Ohio State? They did make huge plays off the edge and beat the Ohio State tackles off the edge and made plays when they needed to win that game. The thing I see out of this Clemson defense, it was basically a joke against top competition just a couple years ago.
Right.
The West Virginia Orange Bowl game is the one that everybody holds up, but it happened time and time again against big opponents where Clemson's defense really let them down, and Taj Boyd would have to put up 50 points to get a win. It's almost flipped the script, or is expected to a certain extent, where this Clemson defense was much better last season, much more respectable, didn't blow the coverage that we commonly saw in the backfield. They actually looked like they wanted to hit people and tackle people, and gave a great effort. Venables came in as the defensive coordinator from Oklahoma, as he's made a big difference, Brent Venables, there with the Clemson defense. So should be a fun matchup, Clemson-Georgia. We expect Deshaun Watson, the true freshman quarterback, to get some playing time, Dabo Swinney says, although Cole Stout is definitely the starter. They've got some things planned for Georgia's defense with Deshaun Watson, more of a dual-threat guy at quarterback. All right, it's a bit of a double header with Fresno State taking on USC. They just met in a bowl game, and I thought that was going to be a really good game. And USC really laid out the defense for Derek Carr and really showed, even though the scholarship reductions have really taken a toll on this roster, that they have top-level talent. They don't have the depth still. They still have issues there, but, man, Josh Shaw and Suet Cravens and Leonard Williams and that USC defense is serious. The front line part of it, I think that still they're going to suffer because of the reductions in the special teams and the depth. But USC and Fresno State with a replacement for Derek Carr at quarterback at Fresno.
Well, I think when you saw heading up into this matchup a few months ago, you'd say that there's a lot of inexperience for Fresno State in terms of the quarterback position. But Brandon Connect comes over from Duke. He played in that system for Kurt Roper, who's now the offensive coordinator at Florida. So he has experience. That's a very solid and a positive for this Fresno State offense. They lose Devontae Adams, their big play wide receiver. I think he's going to be a bigger loss than Carr at this standpoint. Rematch game. I think that you really have to look at it from that perspective. Fresno State did get embarrassed last game of the year against USC, and now they have an opportunity to travel to the Coliseum and really make a statement. Will they win this ball game? I'm not net to really make a difference against still a solid USC defense and Steve Sarkisian, who's, in my estimation, a very underrated head coach, better than they've had there in terms of Ogeron and Lane Kiffin. So I think he'll have his group ready. I think they have a lot of talent still defensively, but I think Fresno State comes to play early and looks to make a statement. I think it could be a tough game early, but USC pulls away late in this matchup.
And for those NFL people that like to scout the teams even that early in the season, Deron Smith at safety for Fresno State, one of the best in the country, the Mountain West Conference Defensive Player of the Year preseason. Florida State, Oklahoma State. Now, this is a matchup, not that it would have been a close game. I'm not saying that it would have been a close game last year, but I would have rather seen this game played last year when Oklahoma State really had a top-notch Big 12 defense and had the quarterback Clint Shelf in place. So it's J.W. Walsh or it's Jason Rudolph for Oklahoma State. And Florida State, to find a weakness on this football team, I'm still searching for one. Yeah, they've lost a bunch of NFL guys, but they're just replacing them with 4- and 5-star guys that have some experience. So this just looks like an overwhelming task for Oklahoma State.
It seems that way, but I still like the tempo perspective with Mike Gundy and that staff. I talked to this with Phil Steele. Everybody loves Florida State. I understand why. Top 5 talent, veteran offensive line, Irving, Jackson, Carlos Williams stepping in for Wilder and Freeman, and they lose Sean Benjamin on the outside, but they have Green, another burner that can really stretch defenses. And then how can you argue with Heisman Trophy winner Jameis Winston coming back? But it's the defense. Jernigan is going to be a big, big loss to that Florida State defense, and still Joyner, who made plays in that secondary. Now, Mike Gundy, not a lot of credit given to him. 10-3 last year. I know he loses Gilbert on the defensive side of the ball, but J.W. Walsh makes plays, and if they can get into a rhythm early, Mark, I think Oklahoma State can challenge Florida State. I still think that they have the offensive tools to really challenge the defense of the Seminoles. I think they can make this a lot closer than people think. I know they're inexperienced defensively, but I just have a gut feeling that Mike Gundy and that staff puts a game plan together that challenges Florida State. I'm not so sure it's a runaway like everybody thinks.
I sure hope you're right, because Florida State just didn't get challenged last season. I wish they would have played anybody non-conference, but they didn't play anyone. And then in the ACC, everybody pointed toward the Clemson game. I think if they would have played Clemson again, they would have shown that they're the better team, but it would have been a game. It bounced their way in the first quarter, and then they just rolled from there, and they just didn't play anyone. Duke in the ACC championship game, and they proved to be the best team, or they did what they had to do against Auburn, of course, but it would have been nice to have seen a tough non-conference slate. But we get Oklahoma State, we get Notre Dame on Florida State's slate this year. Maybe there's some resistance there outside the ACC, and a game against Louisville as well. And you mentioned it. Yes, I love this one, Wisconsin LSU. Wisconsin, if you check out how they play against the SEC, they always play very tough, although I'm going to say with 9 starters back, 9 starters, period, both sides of the football. I don't like that stat for Wisconsin because they lose so much on defense. And the quarterback situation is just, again, it keeps Wisconsin year after year, excluding the 1 year with Russell Wilson, 2011, it keeps Wisconsin from being elite. They're top 15 all the time. But it keeps them from being elite because they always have a Joel Stabby-type quarterback, a guy that's just going to make the throws, but he's not going to scare a defense. And then they can never find outside receivers. They had Abradaris, but they never had a complement to him, and that's been a difficult thing for Wisconsin. Now they don't have Abradaris, so it's going to be difficult for them to break off big plays against this LSU defense.
I agree with you. And is Abadaris still there? Because I feel like Abadaris has been there for about 8 years instead of 5, like he was at Wisconsin. But when you look at the Wisconsin, when you look at the Wisconsin offense as a whole, you're right. Joel Stabby, you could use the word pedestrian. Really didn't win ball games with his arm. Relied on the offensive line and the three-headed monster at running back last year with James White and Melvin Gordon leading the way. But now Melvin Gordon's the go-to guy. A lot of scouts love him. Going to have to really carry the load against the LSU defense. I talked about this on my show and with Phil Steele. He brought up the point that Tanner McAvoy, more of a mobile quarterback, they moved him to safety last year. He's back throwing the football in the spring. He thinks that Gary Anderson will utilize him in the offense because he's mobile, and he liked that type of offense in Utah State with Chucky Keaton. So that's something you got to keep an eye out for. Whether he plays or not, I think that this is a dominating defense by LSU. John Chavis, he's going to challenge the quarterback position for Wisconsin. He's going to put 8 in the box. He's going to force Wisconsin to beat the LSU secondary in terms of the vertical passing game. Are they going to be able to do it is the main question. When you look at LSU's offense, Malachi Dupree really stepped up and turning heads in practice from what I hear. And Leonard Fournette, from what I can read, they're calling him the next Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods. Les Miles is that confident in terms of what his ability brings to the Tigers offense. So that's something that we have to keep an eye out on. Now, who's going to win the quarterback battle in LSU? In my opinion, I think it'll be Jennings, but still not named yet. We'll see maybe next week. That's the key question mark for the Tigers. Who's going to play quarterback, and is there going to be experience at the quarterback position heading up into this matchup? But I really think that the LSU Tigers will challenge the O-line of Wisconsin. Uphill battle for Wisconsin, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're starting to make me think this might get a little out of hand. It's just set up not well for Wisconsin. Again, if you look at last year's matchup against South Carolina, it was a typical Wisconsin matchup against an SEC team. There were like 3 athletic plays made in the fourth quarter that Wisconsin couldn't handle, that Bruce Ellington or somebody like that made against them, against their defensive backs that they just couldn't handle. But otherwise, Wisconsin lined up and ran for like 350 yards against Clowney and Sutton and Quarles. And they were right there. They were right there to win the game and threw the ball in the end zone a number of times in the last 5 minutes to take a lead, and Stabby just wasn't good enough. He got hurt. Kurt Phillips came in. He's not the kind of guy that's going to win a game like that, and that's just the difference between those kind of teams. You stole my thunder with Tanner McAvoy because I was going to make the point as well. That's Gary Anderson's calling card from Utah State. He loves mobile quarterbacks. So does he go conservative, or does he say, you know, this McAvoy's got inexperience, but I'm going to cut him loose because we need somebody who can make some plays against this defense? What's going to be interesting in this game as well, Joe, is that is Les Miles going to go back to the script that beat Iowa in the Outback Bowl with Anthony Jennings? He threw the ball like 16 times in that game. They just hammered it with boy, I can't think of the kid's name that running back for LSU.
Wide receiver?
No, I just
Anthony
completely
Jennings
lost.
And Mettenberger was out.
Yeah, when Mettenberger was out, the
now you
the tailback for LSU. Boy, I can't believe that.
Jennings was the kid that. Tailback Jeremy Hill.
Jeremy Hill.
Jeremy Hill.
Hello. I've only said his name 1,000 times in the last year, but anyway, Jeremy Hill. Yeah, with Kenny Hilliard, Terrence McKee, I think there's a slight drop off, but LSU's fine in the run game. Lyle Collins is maybe the best, one of the best offensive linemen in the SEC. So I'm going to be interested to see if Les Miles, if Jennings is the starter, if he's going to cut him loose or if he's going to say, we can win this game throwing 15 passes and holding it close to the vest and let the defense and the running game do it.
I think personally, I talked about this too. I really think when you look at Les Miles, he built his fame as the Mad Hatter because he would call plays, fake punts, fake field goals, chicanery, which we've grown to love. And then as his teams got better and better in terms of recruiting top 5 talent, he sort of fell back onto really what he had, and that was great talent on both sides of the ball. The one thing that I lean to heading up into this matchup, young quarterback no matter who starts, still young talent like Malachi Dupree and Leonard Fournette. I really think he's going to want these kids to buy into the program. I think he's going to have them come out flying reverses, some fake field goals or punch to get that enthusiasm with these young kids involved. Even though he has that foundation on the offensive line with Collins and on the defensive line, I still think he's going to throw caution to the wind in this ball game and really open it up against Wisconsin. I could be wrong, but that's what I see.
All right, Joe, unless you've got another game, I got one more to hit you up on, and we got a Monday night with Louisville and Miami. And a la the USC Fresno State deal, we've got a doubleheader here because Teddy Bridgewater just lit up that secondary last year like 37-9 in the Russell Athletic Bowl. But this time, again, 2 new quarterbacks going at it. You got Miami, you got Louisville with the Cardinals making their ACC debut.
I think this is a very interesting matchup on a couple of fronts. Yes, Teddy Bridgewater lit them up. He's no longer there. I think it'll be a closer game than people think. Let's talk about Louisville right now. Will Gardner's scheduled to start. Bobby Petrino comes back, but Charlie Strong left that offense very, very well built for Bobby Petrino. He's got 2 dominant running backs in Dominique Brown and Michael Dyer, the standout in the national championship game a few years ago with Cam Newton and Auburn. So 2 big backs that can move the change, and then he's got 2 big play wide receivers in Eli Rogers and Devontae Parker that can really stretch the secondary for Miami. So that's a positive for Louisville heading up into this ball game. The second is they're playing at home. I know that they lose some defensive talent prior, the biggest loss in terms of the safety position. So that's going to be a key matchup going into this ballgame. Can Philip Dorsett and the rest of the wide receiver core of Miami stretch the Cardinals' defense? We'll have to see. When you look at Miami, Jake Heaps, the former BYU quarterback and former quarterback at Kansas, now is practicing with the first team. Before he got there and transferred there, it was Olsen, who did not look good in the spring. So this is a positive for the Hurricane offense that will really take the pressure off the offensive line and Duke Johnson and Gus Edwards. So I think that's a positive if you're a Hurricane fan. The one thing that you have to keep an eye out for, if you're Miami, they have to show up and run support. Denzel Perryman moves from the outside linebacker back inside. It's all going to fall on the defensive line, whether they can force double teams to allow Perryman and the linebacker core to come up and run support. That's been the Achilles heel of the defense over the last 2 years. We'll see if they can do it. I'm leaning right now a little in this matchup. I think Miami has a very good chance with Heaps to pull off the upset, but I'm still undecided right now.
Yeah, we've got some really nice matchups on that opening weekend. I'm looking forward to it. Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Joe, you always bring the knowledge, man.
I'll tell you what, I was looking at one more game, Mark, and I just saw it the other day, and I keep thinking about it, and I want to mention it right now. Utah State, Tennessee. Yeah. That's a very interesting matchup for a couple of reasons. Tennessee, not that great in run support last year. They're at home. They're playing a Utah State team that was 9-5 last year, basically for most of the season without Chucky Keaton. They were 7-1 in the Mountain West Conference. Keaton comes back from injury. They played very well on the road last year, only lost 17-14 to USC, stepped up. They're battle-tested, possible upset special Sunday night because there's no real game outside of Baylor, SMU. All the college football world will be tuning into Knoxville. Could the Aggies strike the upset is a possible question for that game.
Yeah, I think that's a great win to line up. I think those Tennessee fans that aren't real knowledgeable outside the SEC are looking at Oklahoma in like week 2 or 3, not
Right.
looking at Utah State. But you are right. That is a serious football team that laid it on. I believe it was Jordan Lynch, right? Northern Illinois in the bowl game. Their defense
Right.
was phenomenal in that game. And like you say, Chucky Keaton, if he stays healthy, who knows what they could have accomplished last season. But yeah, I saw the game against USC. They went out there and took that to the final possession. It's a serious program there, Utah State, with Gary Anderson, what he built and moved on to Wisconsin, and Matt Wells has done a fine job. We've had him on twice here on Mark Rogers TV as well. Yeah, Utah State is no joke. And Tennessee, I think this might be a statistic that they can only claim that they have lost their entire offensive and defensive line starters from last season. They've recruited very well at wide receiver and in the secondary, but I think they're still a bit shy of SEC standards to compete in that division along the offensive and defensive lines, and the quarterback situation still needs to be worked out for the Vols as well.
Yeah, definitely. Worley just got named the starter late last night. It hit the press wire early this morning. I mean, Worley, the senior, he came back from a thumb injury last year, but still, when you look at this Tennessee offense, only averaging last year about 170 yards in the passing game in the SEC is not going to do it unless you have a dominant offensive line that can run the football. They did, but still didn't overwhelm defense with their rushing attack. So still an uphill battle, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not going to sell Worley as a first-team All-SEC guy or anything close to that, but he got the starting job out of the gate in 2013. Everybody was calling for Dobbs because they were losing games. They put Dobbs in, and as it turned out, if you look at their better performances when they took Georgia to overtime, should have won that game, and when they beat South Carolina, it was Worley at the controls who made some decent throws and at least control the offense and put some points on the board. Yeah, all right, Joe. Appreciate the time, man. Would love the knowledge and the insight. It's good stuff.
Mark, I have a great time on your show. You have a great show. I would love to come back anytime you have me. I can't wait for college football.
Oh, definitely. We'll be calling.
Sounds good. Have a great weekend.
You too.